right. This is another lecture in History 1301. This lecture is going to concern the Protestant Reformation. Protestant Reformation in its entirety is one of the most consequential events in all of Western history. Western Europe is never the same again. Protestant Reformation will upset the political order. It will upset the social order. It will upset the religious order. It will unleash years of warfare, some of which very violent and very bloody. In fact, in the annals of European history, basically going back to the time of Rome, I'd say, there was no series of wars, the wars for religion, the wars for Reformation, that were as bloody or as violent or as just cruel they're the most that are out there, excepting the 20th century. 20th century, you had the First World War, which in its own right was called the World War to end all wars. Then, more particularly in the in the mid 20th century, of course, World War II was a war of ideology with the Nazism on the one hand, Bolshevist communism on the other, and on the one and then the other. But realistically, we're talking about also the Allies in the form of the Americans and the British as a third way or another way. Well, anyways, but the wars for religion and the Reformation is entirely consequential. And so the majority of this lecture today is going to be covering and dealing with the actions of Martin Luther and some of those who come after him. But before we get to Martin Luther himself and bring him in and give a full discussion about him, the fact of the matter is probably need to set the table a little bit more on the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, as I said in the previous lecture, is the dominant religious and even a very loud political force in all of Europe prior to 1517. And the Catholic Church is sitting atop that heap. Yet there are problems in the greater ecclesiastical setting. Between the Babylonian captivity of the Church, rank incompetence and at times corruption. You're also, as I did not mention these folks, but you'll also see some of the papal activities and the folks around the papacy in Vatican City and Rome are very unsavory and sometimes overblown in the form of modern movies and mythology. But certainly the Borgias, which are spelled B-O-R-G-I-A, the Borgias as an influential family, an Italian family very influential in church politics, leave a lot to be desired. But anyways, you'll also notice, too, that in the early Renaissance period, and I mentioned this in the previous lecture, I talked about it in the form of a rediscovery of the ancient ways. I left out the issue of architecture. But in the 1400s and into the 1500s, you're going to see the resurrection, the rediscovery of pagan architecture. And when I say pagan, I mean Roman architecture, Greek architecture, hearkening back to the past, but yet with a modern flair to it, as it were. You'll see I guess you would say the restraint of the Thomist period of the 1200s gone, and you're going to see some of the most beautiful pieces of architecture built or attempt to be built in this time period. And so that's part of it out as well. So let's go ahead and pick up the story of the Protestant Reformation. Protestant Reformation is credited to have begun on October 31st, 1517. But in reality, about 100 years before, about 14, 20, 25 territory, the fact is that you're going to have what you could call a precursor, a forerunner to the Protestant Reformation. Some have likened Luther to Jesus, and others have likened Jan Hus, this other man, to John the Baptist. Whether that is overblown, probably is, but at the same time, it is somewhat analogous. John Huss, or you may also write it in your notes as Jan, Jan-H-U-S-S, Jan Hus. John Huss was a Bohemian preacher and pastor, and Catholic preacher, of course, in the what we would call today the Czech Republic. May have been actually in Slovakia, but in Central Europe, with the old Czechoslovakia territory. Now, Huss was a dynamic man. He just had charisma going through his veins. And in his time period, Huss he preached in that territory, preached in Prague, as I recall, as well. And Huss is going to preach so dynamically that his listeners would ask him, "What are you saying? What are you saying?" But for whatever reason, what he was saying just had it drew people to him. And so the thing to remember about the Catholic Mass, especially for those of you who are not Catholic and don't know how the history of the church is run, but the Catholic Mass of today, and some of you who are practicing Catholics may not know this either, but the Catholic Mass of today is different than it was, say, 100 and, just 50 years ago, 60 years ago. But the Catholic Mass of Huss's time period, of Luther's time period, up into the mid-20th century was different in presentation. First of all, the altar, which today sets off and faces the congregation, the altar of which the Mass is where the Mass is going to be said at, the altar back prior to what's called Vatican II is going to sit on the back wall of the church, or the nave. And basically what you would have is the priest with his back turned to the parishioners, or the congregants, to use a Protestant term. But the parishioners will be all kneeling. The priest will himself be kneeling, and he will be saying the Mass in Latin, facing the back wall, facing that altar. And that's the way it was done. And Mass until Vatican II of the 1960s, 1963 particularly, Vatican II changed it. But prior to that, Mass, the part where the host and the wine become the body and blood of Christ, the heart of the Catholic worship experience, that sacramental aspect, the Eucharist, is all done in Latin. It was done in Latin since basically at least the 300s, maybe if not before, because at some point there's going to be a less official aspect to it and more just a practical, this is what we speak aspect. But Latin was the dominant language of the church going up and through the Reformation and even into the 20th century to one degree or another. So you had the Mass, which is the heart of the worship service, is said by the priest in Latin with his back turned to the congregation or the parishioners. And so that's a major difference from what you may be familiar with today, or even if you've never been to a Catholic Mass, so now you know. So anyways, but normally what would happen next is the priest, this normally would happen before the Mass would be said, the Eucharist celebrated. The priest would end up giving a homily, a little short sermon, maybe 15 minutes long, maybe 5 minutes long, depends on the movement of the priest, I guess you could say. And he would say his words, he would say his part, but normally that would be given in the vernacular tongue, meaning the local language, whether that's Spanish or German or French or whatever, in this case, Czech. The fact of the matter is that in the case of the case of Huss, he would give it in Latin. He was an educated man. Now, to my knowledge of Huss, he didn't always do that. But at the end of the day, he did in this situation here. These situations, and so he started just to speak and preach, not just or do the Mass in Latin, but he also would preach in Latin. Well, moving along, not only did he preach in Latin, but his hearers, as I said, wanted to know what he was saying. And so that was quite a development, and they were asking him, why don't you tell us what you're saying? And Huss's answer was basically, no, I won't do it. I won't do it. And finally, the parishioners begged and pleaded enough to say, tell us what you're saying, because we don't understand it, but we like it. He switched. And there was the heart of the matter. What Huss is going to start to do is that he is preaching, in essence, heresy in the eyes of the Catholic Church. And the heresy is this, and it's one of the major division points of the church, is that the head of the church is not the Pope. The head of the church is Jesus, and it is a fundamental difference. To this day, it is a fundamental difference between Protestants of many stripes, if not all, and the Catholic Church. It is, if you wanted to say what are some of the major differences, and I'm liable to, if there's an exam attached to this, then of course there is, I am liable to go into that territory some way or another, but that is one of the fundamental differences. Who's the head of the church? Is it Jesus or is it the Pope? Difference of opinion right there. And it's say opinion, each side would say it's not an opinion, it's a fact. Anyways, all that to say is that he says that. And he goes on and he continues to critique the leadership of the church. But that was the big one right there. And when finally it got out and it got sent around to Huss's superiors that he had criticized and called into question the headship of the papacy, He's called down on it, and he refuses to recant. He was given safe passage to a hearing. Long story short is that he was declared a heretic, put out of the church, excommunicated. Good word for you right there. When you hear the word excommunicated, it's not just means that, like in a Baptist sense, that you churched him or you kicked him out, but you not only kicked him out of the church. In essence, in Catholic dogma, you kicked him out of heaven. So you kicked him out of purgatory. So he is condemned to hell. And so because of that ruling, it was said that you did not have to keep your word to a heretic. He was captured, he was burned at the stake, and he died. Anyways, the fact is that John Huss, his nickname, or rather his last name Huss in Czech, comes to us in English as Goose. He is John Goose, is be like saying his name. But anyways, so there's a phrase, something to keep in the back of your mind. It will be years later, about 100 years later, that Luther is visiting the grave of John Huss, and he's looking at Huss's grave, and Luther, who is the most prominent and arguably the most important face of the Protestant Reformation, says to his hearers, he's like, well, Huss's goose was cooked. So if you've ever heard that expression, so-and-so's goose was cooked, that is an expression going back to the age of the Reformation, and it refers to Huss. Yet some of the major, or at least one of the major points of the Reformation is found 100 years before Luther undertakes his 95 Theses on October 31st, 1517. But to the story of Martin Luther. Now, Luther is born of middling, or really probably high middling, if not low elite status in Greater Germany. He is the son of numerous children of Hans and Margaret Luther. Later it's translated as the Luther as we understand it, and I will call him Martin Luther, but originally the Luther clan did not refer to themselves as Luther, but as Luder, L-U-D-E-R. Give me a second. But Hans and Margaret Luther were, frankly, fairly successful individuals. And when young Martin was born in 1483, November 10th, 1483, the Luther family were successful enough as traders and merchant types that Hans Luther had determined that one of his kids needed to go to college. And as the years passed, it became obvious that it was Martin who was the golden boy. Martin who was the chosen one. It's not going to be one of the sisters. It's not going to be one of the daughters. Just it is what it is for that time period in German society. But it was going to be Martin, and it was Martin's duty, kind of like the father putting onto the son what his vision for the future would be, a vision for the son's future would be, and by extension the family's future, is that Martin was supposed to become a lawyer. And all that training, all that activity and so forth at about the age of 18, about the same age as you are right now, most of you watching this, Martin Luther was sent off to the University of Erfurt there in Greater Germany. But so let me say this about Germany in this time period. There is no such thing as Germany. Germany, as we understand it, does not come into existence until the 1870s. Yes, there are Germanic peoples. Yes, there is a German language, but you have what is called, and put this in your notes, I've referred to it once before, under the guise of Charlemagne. But you have the Holy Roman Empire, which one waggish individual once said was not holy, wasn't Roman, and it wasn't an empire. But the Holy Roman Empire is this conglomeration of German feudal states from the big to the small and some in between. And that is the organized principle of Central Europe for the most part. So it's kind of a confederacy. It is headed by an emperor, but a lot of these electors and kings and princes and so forth, they have a whole lot of discretion and a whole lot of independence compared to their emperor. The emperor doesn't just snap his fingers and everything happens. It's much more confederate than that. And so anyways, back to Luther, he goes to school to become a lawyer at the University of Erfurt in 1501. So that's kind of moving the part along now. The reality is that Luther at the University of Erfurt was a common and typical college student. And he himself, and I'm quoting now, he's talking about this later in life, looking back, and Luther was a talker. Luther, in some respects, of all the characters you come across in the Protestant Reformation, Luther is kind of one of the most human, and he's pious, but in his own Luther sort of way. Luther will use phrases and turn and be a little bit crude and earthy. Some of his disputes and spats with some of his erstwhile friends, and certainly his run-ins with the church, he's going to sling invective and nastiness with the best of them. So anyways, which makes, by the way, as a professor, and if any of you get into teaching, makes for good historical teaching because you can use all these quotes. Anyways, this is one of them. And he referred to the University of Erfurt later on in life at one of his table talks. He said it was nothing but beer houses and whorehouses. And so whether Luther visited the beer houses, we know he liked his cold drink every so often. And by the way, if I use the phrase cold drink, that is a reference to alcohol. It's my euphemism for alcohol. It goes, my grandmother, who was a teetotaling Baptist, did not drink a drop, and that was her way of saying, did they have any alcohol? She'd call it cold drinks. So anyways, it kind of give you an idea. She wouldn't let the word pass her lips. But anyways, all that to say is that we know Luther went to the beer houses. Did he go to the bordellos? We don't know. I wouldn't put it past a young man who wasn't a priest or considering the priesthood at that point in time. But at the same time, who can tell? He didn't leave a record for it that I know of, and that's just probably as well. But he is passing along. It's kind of an uneventful, preparation. He's getting ready to become a lawyer, which is going to be very, very lucrative to the family, would make the family wealthy and do well. It's also worth noting, too, that Luther, when it comes to his preparation for the law, is also going to be given a book. I'm trying to think of one in my office that I don't have. I have, as you can see behind me, I've got 1 million books stacked up everywhere. And this is just an old paperback dictionary that I've got hanging around, so that's kind of thick. Something along those lines there, but actually thicker and bigger. Would be the law book that Hans gave his son Martin as a more or less a gift for graduation. The law book of Germany, in essence, the law book of the Holy Roman Empire. This is a big, thick, and it was expensive. It'd be like the equivalent of essentially buying a car for your son, or or I should say this better, some of you probably got a car upon your high school graduation. That would be that sort of equivalent, that sort of gift. And it wasn't just a cheap, worn-out Dodge from 1992, but we're talking about, an expensive car, perhaps, maybe not a Lexus, but certainly a higher-end Toyota or something of that nature. All that which is to say, Luther got this beautiful book, and it's supposed to help him, and it's supposed to move his life along and make him into a lawyer, a prominent lawyer, bringing glory and money to the family. All things that Hans Luther desired. However, depends on probably how you view religion and how you view the existence of deity, probably how you'd answer this question here. But when it comes to Luther, and understand this, I didn't say this explicitly in the last lecture, but there's always been people who have doubted the existence of deity basically since the dawn of time. I don't deny that a bit. But in the times prior to, say, Charles Darwin, or say the Enlightenment perhaps, but certainly a Darwin era, which would be the 19th century, the very vast majority of individuals default to there is a God. There is the existence of deity. Now, would they say it in a Christian sense? Maybe so, maybe not. But the fact of the matter is that when we say they default to God, that's how you answer the great questions of life. Where'd I come from? What happens when I die? And things in between. So for Luther, he is a Catholic. There's no doubt about that. He is a Christian. Is he terribly devout? To my knowledge, not so much. Not saying he never goes or anything, but obviously he knows his dogma. He's a smart man. But on the 2nd of July in 1505, Luther is traveling, and he is traveling in the dark, which, understand this, compared to, especially for those of you who are from major cities like Houston or San Antonio or Dallas or something like that, where it never gets dark because of artificial light. If you've ever been in the middle of nowhere where there is no artificial light beaming that kind of lights the sky up a little bit, and even here compared to Houston's small Bryan College Station, there's enough artificial light that I have seen added in my lifetime that the nights aren't nearly as dark as they once were. But in 1505, there is no electricity, and the only light you have is from torch or candle for the most part. It's very dark in the nighttime. Throw into the fact is also what's going to happen next is Luther's going to get caught in a thunderstorm. He's going to get caught in a thunderstorm in the nighttime on July 2nd. He's traveling, and Luther doesn't know what a thunderstorm is. He knows that it happens and these things occur, but until very recently, at least until the Enlightenment or later, most people thought that a thunderstorm was some sort of act of divine judgment or divine activity. Some put more emphasis on it than others. But what are those things that flash in the sky? I mean, what are they? And so today we know it's electricity. It's not a big deal. Well, it is a big deal. You don't want to get struck by it. But at the same time, you know what it is. And thank you, Benjamin Franklin. But in 1505, Luther knows nothing of that. And, a lot of folks would say you getting caught in a thunderstorm or you get killed, there was a divine judgment about it, something akin to what Job's friend said to Job. But all of which is to say is that he's got his pants scared off of him. And if you've ever been in a lightning storm and even the knowledge of what you're dealing with, meaning is that, oh, it's just electricity. If you ever got caught in an electrical storm out in the open, you get pretty nervous, and especially when it's striking close to you. One personal example was we were trying to build fence, as I do in the summer times. And we were building fence and driving T-post, which is basically a metal post with a steel driver into the ground. I was foolish for doing what I was doing, and I had some guys who were working with me, and we tried to push it a little bit, and we should have bailed out of there sooner because lightning can travel, and it doesn't have to just be over top of you to get struck. So anyways, what we're doing is we're creating static electricity, or we're creating electrical magnetic electricity, and we're doing it with a grounding rod and so forth. It's just a combination of foolishness on my part. Well, we didn't quit that until lightning struck within about a mile of us, and we hit it, you basically boom, boom, sort of thing, which all of you have heard that before. We went running out of the field, jumped in the trucks, and called it a day. Luther doesn't know that. And we still were, nervous. And Luther's scared, and he thinks he's going to die. And so what he does is he calls out and he says, "Help me, Saint Anna. Help me, Saint Anna. If I survive, I will become a monk." And he survives that night. Now, a lot of people who make that deal with deity, and, sometimes it's oversimplified and sometimes done quite well in fiction and books and accounts and such, but you make a deal with God, help me, Lord, get me through this, or I'll become a preacher or whatever. Then you get through it, a lot of folks will start to crawfish. The fact of the matter is that when it comes to Luther, when he made a vow, he was not somebody who was going to trifle on the subject and waffle. He makes the vow and he becomes a preacher. He says, "I will become a monk or a priest," and he does. And he is going to become, you can put it in your notes, an Augustinian monk. It's an order within the Catholic Church. You have the Jesuits, the Augustinians, Franciscans, and probably some others that I don't know about. The fact is that he becomes an Augustinian monk, and Luther is he's very devout. In July 17th, right as he's graduating from the college, and he really hadn't told his family this all that much, he has a graduation party, which some of you had when you were graduating from high school, a month or two or whatever, because of the COVID, whenever you actually walked the stage. Y'all had a party. Hopefully it was a socially distanced, yada, yada party. And trust me, I believe in social distancing. I know too much. But the fact of the matter is that even in times gone by, you maybe went to a cousin's graduation party last year or 5 years ago, and you remember it. Well, in college or in high school, sometimes you go to a restaurant, and this is what Luther does. He goes to a restaurant, and all his friends are there, and they're having good times, as only Germans can have. They were eating food, and they're drinking good beer, and then dramatically, as the evening is coming to a close, Luther stands up and he says, "This is the last time you will see me. I have become a monk, and I will take holy orders today." And so Luther stands up, and just like a thunderbolt out of clear blue sky. His friends go from jubilation and celebration to what just happened. And Luther then goes and knocks on the door there at Erfurt to this Augustinian monastery, and he knocks on the door. Dramatically, he says, I present myself. It's all kind of ceremonial ritual. And they knew he was coming, and they let him in, and he becomes a monk. He goes through the training. Long story short, he becomes an ordained priest. Ordained Catholic priest. So I guess that you ought to remember that. Luther does not start out as a Lutheran minister. He starts out as a Catholic priest. He is a convinced Catholic. He is devout. He is strong. And so he sets up shop, and he is of a Augustinian of that era. He is very much a monastic sort of guy. By the way, Hans Luther was not impressed. Daddy Luther was not excited. And the story goes that when Martin was ordained and made a Catholic priest, when they laid hands on him and the sacrament of holy orders was conferred, the fact is that after the ceremony, after the sacrament was performed, one of Luther's mentors asked Hans Luther, "Aren't you proud of your son?" And Hans said basically, "No, I'm not." Because being a Catholic priest back in the day, and probably even today, some of you would know this. If you went to your parents and said, "By the way, I've decided to become a priest," some of your parents, or become a preacher, some of your parents would say, "Why did you waste your time at Texas A&M, and why did you waste my money?" Others would be very excited. Probably depends on the parents and the family. But Hans Luther, no. Now, he basically said, I thought I read somewhere, I thought I knew that you were supposed to honor your father and mother. And Luther took that to mean is that I set this course out for my son. I paid this money. He was to be a lawyer, and now look what he's going to become. He's going to throw his life away as a priest. And, obviously for a lot of folks, becoming a priest was common back in the day. It was one of the ways to move on in life and to have a living. But, of course, Hans does not know that his son's going to be one of the 5 most important individuals of the last millennia. So other than that, he had a point. Martin Luther goes into the priesthood, and he is devout. He is devout, and I think you need to make sure you understand that completely. He is a devout man. He takes his vows seriously, and seemingly whereas other men would relax and catch your breath, Luther, especially at this point in his life, he's a young, idealistic man, and he believes it. He believes in what he's doing. He has obviously got ability. Going through seminary and school and such as he does, he is going to demonstrate his intellectual capacity, and so that marks him out as a young monk worth noting, someone who might become a prominent voice in religious circles there in Germany. But that's years down the road. That's the idea. So Luther in his 20s, maybe even the early 30s, is working his way up through the ranks of his monastic order. He is tapped to do, along with some other monks, to take a trip to Rome. Traveling from Germany to Rome was kind of one of those religious pilgrimages that I talked about in the last lecture. This is a pilgrimage that can gain you special favor with the Almighty. You could receive blessings and sacraments for doing that. You could receive indulgences. You better write that word down. But you could receive indulgences for that, for those sorts of things. And Luther is excited about going to the great city of Rome. But Luther, he makes this trip to Rome in 1589, kind of as a junior member of this traveling party of Augustinian monks on business. And Luther's excited. The problem with Rome in 1508, 1509 is it's a dang cesspool. It is and I don't mean that flippantly. I mean literally the excrement runs in the streets. The water was so bad in Rome that anybody who knew anything about Rome knew that you did not drink the water. And even if you were there to be there for 2 or 3 weeks, you just didn't drink the water because it would kill you. It may give you cholera or some other waterborne disease. But so it give you an idea how fouled up the old great city used to be. If you had the money and ability, you didn't hang around Rome all that much because it was a disease factory. And like I said before to you, when you dig around in the old cesspools of times gone by, and it would have been true for Rome of that era, you found a whole lot of parasites. So how do you, if you don't drink the water, what do you do? one of the things that was practiced, and it was a kind of a stopgap measure to being hydrated, was that you would eat and suck on pomegranates. Those pomegranates had enough liquid and water in them, and they were cleansed through the natural processes of growing on trees. That's how you stayed, how you didn't die from thirst. Now, obviously, people did drink the water and so on, but Luther was smart enough to know that. Or when I say smart enough, he was told not to do it, and he didn't. So he didn't die from cholera, obviously. But also, while Luther is in Rome too, he goes on the pilgrimage aspect. He's a devout believer. He's a true believer. He is a devout Catholic. There's no at this point in his life, 15:9. There is no great moments of doubt that are popping up. There may be hints that you can see, but he makes pilgrimages of trying to climb up. I don't remember the name of the steps, but going up the steps on your knees, and various and sundry things that was common in medieval and early Renaissance Catholicism, acts of piety and so forth, donations of charity and so on. Those things that were to, I guess you could say, ingratiate yourself not just with the church, but also with God himself, but the church acting as the intermediary. That stuff about the intermediary of the priest. It is said that Luther, looking back on it, did notice there were some, whereas he knew his intentions were right, at least as he understood it at that time, but he noticed there were a lot of priests and a lot of holy men, meaning Catholic monastic types, who were not necessarily in the bordellos or anything like that, but there just seemed to be so common and so kind of, they'd burned over and they had kind of died out. And it just seemed like they were just going through the motions or didn't care all that much. It just seemed to be, looking behind the scenes, it did not impress Luther. Anyways, however, that all to say, though, is that he goes to Rome, and it's something he never forgot. He saw the great city. He saw the great buildings and monuments that were going up, the old antique architecture from the old Roman period and so forth. But as he grows older and he deepens his time and spends more time in the monastic order, he is going to start to feel the pangs of doubt and the pangs of insecurity. Luther is a serious man. But serious men oftentimes, sometimes even serious men who aren't completely wedded to reality. And by the way, I think Luther was quite realistic. But these are the men who are going to press forward and make a breakthrough or change history. And Luther, what his problem was is that the more he studied, the more he thought, and he's a man who knew Latin. He's going to learn Greek. He's going to be a master of languages. You need to write that down. So he's a Renaissance man in that sense. He's early Renaissance there. The more he studies the Bible and the more he studies what the scriptures say, he becomes convinced that he is a wicked man. And he writes these sorts of things later on, talking about his great transformation. But he is a man of sin. He's a man of evil. And so, and this is a Catholic priest who's saying these things. He's writing these things, and it bothers him. So how do you reduce sin in one's life? How do you reduce sin off of your soul? How do you, as it were, protect your immortal soul from the fires of hell? And the Catholic answer is going to be penance, reconciliation, confession. Those are all synonymous terms for the same sacrament: penance, reconciliation, confession. And he says all that. And he thinks all those things, and he goes through it. Most men who are like Luther, most men who are like Luther in the sense that they're monks, they go to confession for a period of time, meaning 2 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Monastic life is not a life of ease. It is not a life of Riley. You get up, in the case of Luther, at about 4 a.m. You start with prayers. You start with supplications. You eat very little throughout the day. Luther was as thin as a rail at this point in his life. He was very much monastic. And at times, you'll see this with Luther and others. Luther, and others like him, will apply whips and chains, as it were, to punish themselves for their sins and misdeeds. Most men, however, when they have these pangs of censorship, self-censorship, self-reproach of "I'm not worthy," they go to confession. And for most of them, the confession is sufficient. But every so often, and Luther's not unusual. He's not unique. He's just unusual, perhaps is a better way to say it. Luther is like a few people throughout the monastic era of the high monastic era of Catholicism, that they will come under the attack, as it were, of doubt and reproach and so on. And so the answer is, when Luther, who started to give these confessions that would last not just for 10 minutes or 5 minutes, but every day last for an hour or two, eventually you could almost imagine some of Luther's confessors seeing Luther coming down the hallway to confession, jumping out of the booth, as it were. And now, admittedly, they may not have used a booth, because sometimes you can do confession face to face. But sometimes these confessors, you can almost be looking for a way to get away from Luther, because you knew it was going to be a while. And Luther confessed everything he could think of, because that's what you're supposed to do. But the thing to keep in mind, too, is that not only do you confess the sins of commission, things you did, but also the sins of omission, the things that you did not do. And, oh, by the way, what happens if you forget some sins along the route? Does that weigh upon you? And, of course, the answer in Catholic dogma is yes. And Luther took it all seriously. So it's sins of commission, sins of omission, things you forgot to say in the booth, in the confessional. And so all those things weigh on Luther, and it just eats him alive. It got to the point where Luther became embittered. He said himself later on, he said, I hated God. And again, this is a Catholic priest who is going through all this. But he's not unique in Catholic history. Others had gone through that, and so the answer from the church was, calm down, slow down, get your mind off of what you're fretting over, what you're fixated on, and move on. And it will happen. It may take a while to get the bitterness out. It may take a while to get the self-doubt out, but it will happen. It had happened before. So what Luther's superiors in the Augustinian order he was a part of said, Luther, go take a degree in this order, and you got to go get a master's degree in languages. And so Luther does. Luther does exactly that. And so Luther is going to take a degree. He learns Greek very well. He learns it well enough that he can translate it, and he's going to, by the way, put this in your notes, the first German language translation of the Bible is going to be done by Martin Luther, so it's called the Luther Bible. And by the way, if you did not know, one of the practices of the Catholic Church until Vatican II of the 1960s was to restrict the reading of the Bible. And that's something else you need to make note of too. If you get a series of questions, who did what? One of the things is that Protestants are, especially Lutheran and Presbyterian, and by extension Baptist, Methodist, are big promoters of the spoken word and the written word and the preached word and so forth. Essentially, the Bible. And by the way, everybody can read it. It's not like it's a secret. However, in the Catholic practice, until the days of Vatican II, the Catholic Church did not encourage, in fact, in some respects, prohibited the rank and file, the parishioner in the pew, from reading the Bible. And the reason being, a Protestant would take a different view than this, but a Catholic answer would be is that if you read the Bible and you misinterpret it, guess what happens to you when you die? And that is, you go into the hellfire. So it was a protective aspect from the Catholic perspective. Protestants would disagree very strongly, especially in certain circles. But anyways, the rank and file Catholic would not need to read the Bible, frankly would be prohibited from it. But because Luther is a monk and he is getting a degree in languages, he's becoming all the more familiar with the Bible, and it's this thing that was designed to tune him down or cool him down and turn him into a contented, at least in the main, Catholic monk is not working. And what is happening is that Luther is struggling with this self-doubt, this self-censorship, this doubt that he is actually a man who has been saved, to use a Baptist term. But the fact of the matter is that he's worried, and he can't get it out of his head. But in the meantime, put this in your notes, he is going to be translated. He is going to be transferred to the University of Wittenberg. In German, it's kind of the W comes out with a V, but Wittenberg or Wittenberg. There, it's a small country village. if you want to think of it as a kind of an out-of-the-way place, the University of Wittenberg, where Luther is going in about 1508, it's going to be about 1510, 1512, where he's going. That little university is new. It is out of the way. It's something akin to, say, in Tarleton State University at Stephenville. It's perhaps, maybe you might even go as far as to say West Texas A&M over at Plainview and up in the Panhandle. But basically, it's not A&M, it's not UT, it's not Harvard, it's not Yale, it's not a big, well-known university. It's out of the way. And Luther is there to teach languages and to basically be a professor and a guide. So Luther in 1510, it's going to be about 1512, 1515, is going to go to teaching. By 1517, moving the story forward, Luther is also becoming aware of some other things that are going on around him. And that has to do with the selling of indulgences. But before we get to Luther and the selling of indulgences, we need to finish Luther's more important work. And that is his great breakthrough. Sometimes it is called the Tower Confession, the Tower Discovery. But Luther's health was not always great. And in fact, Martin Luther's health at times was bad. That is a common thing, a theme in pre-modern time periods, pre-medicine. You always kind of felt bad. Maybe it was the parasites. And in case of Luther, especially when he was under stress or worry, he had a lot of issues with his bowels. A horribly constipated man, and he never had any laxatives to speak of. He couldn't go take X-Lax or Miralax or any of those other laxatives. He was always bound up. And of course, he didn't know what the Karankawa Indians knew of Texas, which is that if you eat something that's fried, that helps it out. So Luther will spend time in the men's room. He will spend time in latrines, not say latrines, but it's really an outhouse. It's a tower outhouse trying to pass some stools. Anyways, he is teaching while he's worried about his constipation and worried about his immortal soul. He's teaching school. And what he's teaching on is important. You need to write this down too, because this is that idea that a Protestant's going to have is that you need to read the Bible and you need to take it to heart and you need to live it out. That's a heavy, heavy emphasis of the Scriptures alone compared to, say, the Catholic Church, which is not the Scriptures alone. We'll talk more about that in a second. But Luther's reading two books, and he's teaching on two books at this time, one of which is the Psalms. And by the way, if you've ever read the Psalms, you know it's a fairly complicated and complex set of Hebrew Scriptures, Hebrew songs, as it were, sayings and laments and so on. If you're only familiar with the 23rd Psalm because that is what has been said many times over the years at a funeral or in church or whatever, if all you can think and conceive of the Psalms is just a 23rd Psalm, that would be a mistake. The 23rd Psalm, if it's trying to say, well, what does that actually say? I've never heard it before. The 23rd Psalm goes like this: The Lord is my shepherd, this is the King James Version. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, if that's all you've ever heard, that is a very uplifting thing. I mean, that's why it's read oftentimes at funerals, even if the man or the woman who died was frankly never devout or never a believer. It's read. It's comforting. But the fact of the matter is if you actually read through the Psalms as you go, you notice rather quickly that those types of Psalms, like the 23rd, are there, but there's others that are also much less comforting and much more honest and so on. And in that sense, from a deeper perspective, the Psalms oftentimes offer comfort in very dark hours. For Luther, he's teaching through the 22nd Psalm, and I need you to write that down, the 22nd Psalm, which is, of course, just one over from the 23rd Psalm. The 22nd Psalm is actually, for some of you, very familiar, at least the opening lines. because at least you've heard this because you went to church on Easter, or you grew up having Easter pageants, or perhaps a passion play or something like that, as they used to in days gone by. And it's Jesus on the cross whose some of his final words were, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And those are the opening lines. That's the opening sentence of the 22nd Psalm. And it goes on from there. "Why art thou so far from me? From helping me, and from the words of my roaring." And on it goes. "Oh my God, I cry in the daytime, but thou hearest not." That, for many believers over the years, regardless of exactly what denomination, that has been a heart cry. And for Luther, that was the problem. He was there. He cried out, and where was God? But it also dawned on him. And again, this next statement I'm about to make probably depends how you view it, depends on your view of deity, whether deity exists or deity does not exist, i.e., does God exist or does he not? But if you have struggled with doubt, you've struggled with pain, at times God seems distant, and yet at times there is going to be some sort of breakthrough. God himself will come through in some respects, and not maybe very dramatically, maybe not, but you understand it better by and by as the song goes. Others would say, well, it works out of your system. But neither here nor there. In the 22nd Psalm, Luther is teaching through this, and he says, this is me. This is me. This is my struggle with self-doubt. This is my struggle with God. But it wasn't that it was just comforting in that sense. There was a psalmist who wrote it. But think about it, as I just said, who also said this. And so for Luther to look back and he said, you know what, it finally dawned on him. Maybe he'd read it 15 times, but sometimes if you've ever read something, you've ever thought about something, you've ever done something, it may not have ever made sense until like the 12th time or the 8th time or the 50th time. But for whatever reason, that time, it just snapped and it came together. And for Luther, that 22nd Psalm, the fact that Jesus said that on the cross, gave him comfort that he had not had before. And so the breakthrough is happening. And for Luther, he's like, if Jesus can say this, I am not alone. I am not alone. And so there is the first step in the conversion of, in the turn of Martin Luther. Secondly, and additionally, that does not settle him in his mind over, am I, to use a Baptist term, saved or am I not? The better word for your notes is not the word saved. Again, that's more of a Baptist evangelical term. The better phrase for your notes is the word justified. Am I justified in my faith in the sight of a holy God? Remember, if you are thinking about Luther, and when we get to talking about the Second Great Awakening later in the semester and elsewhere, that issue of holiness, that issue of being justified and before a perfect and just and gracious God is an extraordinarily important issue. And for Luther, the issue is eventually going to be yes. And so he has done all he can, and he can't confess enough. He can't beat himself enough. He can't do penance enough to get past the fact that he's forgetting a sin, or he is not as pure as he ought to be in order to be and appear before an almighty God. And so for Luther, the greater one would be this. And so I'm going to flip I've got a Bible open in front of me, as you can see. But I would say it like this. You need to write this next passage of Scripture down. It is the first chapter of Romans particularly. And it is Romans 1 and 17. And it is from the pen of Paul, and whom Luther himself is going to become very fond of. And it is really one of the touchstones of the Protestant Reformation and it's true for Luther and Lutheranism, and they come out of that realm. But Paul, the writings of Paul will become very, very important. So the fact of the matter is that when it comes to Paul, he writes this, and it is in the first chapter of Romans. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed, from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. While Luther, the way he told the story later on in life of his conversion, and it's called, like I said a few minutes ago, the Tower Conversion, is that he became convinced that he was, again a Baptist phrase, he was saved. He was justified in his faith by faith. And so he, because of his faith, not because of his works, but because of his faith, he had been saved. And so one of the things you best understand, and one of the major division points between Catholics and Protestants, has to do with the issue of faith. A Protestant would say, and this is almost to a man in Protestant history or to the present time, faith alone. How are you saved? By simply believing. And so you are justified by faith. The just shall live by faith. And so Luther, when it finally dawned on him, and he had studied this, he had read it, and for the umpteenth time, how much it was, but there, while he was straining to get out feces, and I'm being polite in how I'm saying it, he was in a world of feces, yet there he was, and yet it was there his eyes had been opened, and he was translated out of that feces and translated into heaven, and he would never be drug out of it again. All those doubts and all those fears and all those inner turmoils that racked him for years disappeared overnight. And so Martin Luther, in the middle, as he said it, when this dawned on him, he was literally in the bathroom. He went from feces to heaven. And so he never was, it was never the same again for him. And that's what emancipated him from all that self-doubt. But to be clear, a Catholic would say, yes, faith matters. And I don't want you to think that Catholics only believe in works. No, that's not true. But the Catholic answer had been for years and to the present time, faith plus works indicates salvation or justification. For the Protestant, it is faith alone. So if you noticed on your review sheet, sometime maybe you got it, maybe you haven't, but there's a statement about the 5 solas. Faith alone, grace alone, Christ alone, glory of God alone, the Bible or Scripture alone, and those are the major themes. And so when you talk about Luther and then later those others who come after him or contemporaries of him, they put a heavy emphasis not just on grace and faith alone, but grace is the thing that God confers or Christ confers from the cross to the believer. And all you do by faith is accepted, using a Protestant phraseology. But for Scripture, that is a major division point. The Catholic Church would say this, mark this down. The Catholic Church, how do you know your faith? Well, one of which is through, how do you know your faith? How do you know your religion? It is through the Scriptures. The Catholic Church does not deny the existence of Scriptures. They would affirm them. But they would say there is a 3-legged stool on which you will build your confidence. Scriptures is one. 2, it is the magisterium of the church, or the papacy particularly. Number 3, tradition. You put those 3-legged stool together, that's what you build your faith on. Whereas the Protestants would say, no, the papacy is fallible. Tradition is not a good guide and rule. The Scriptures alone. So major division point right there. So Luther is going to be moved. And so this is, when I say this, I want to be explicitly clear. This is his most important contributions to history, because what it does is this uncorks the Protestant Reformation right here. The Protestant Reformation is not going to be just a slight quibbling on the edges of Catholicism. This is a clean break with the Catholic Church, and you're going to see theologically and doctrinally, there's going to be massive fighting over this between Catholics and Protestants over the years. And to this day, if you prick the right person, as it were, who is Catholic, or you rub the right person who, as it were, was a Protestant, who are very attuned to this sort of thing, they still disagree sometimes quite vehemently over this subject. So that's there. Luther is going to promote, let me finish this thought, but then I can get to the thing that everybody thinks of Luther and the Reformation as the inciting incident. But the fact of the matter is, with Luther, you're going to see some major changes, some of which I've already alluded to. So emphasis on the 5 solas, the 5 alones. And this is going to be taken beyond Luther and expanded by people like John Calvin. 5 solas, the 5 alones: faith alone, Christ alone, grace alone, the Bible alone, I would say that, and for the glory of God alone. Those are the 5 solas. So those are big. Secondly, the headship of the church. Luther, especially as he goes through his personal trials and as he struggles with and fights back against the church and they fight him, Luther is going to disavow, and he's going to say that no, it is not the Pope who's the head of the church, but it is Jesus or the Christ who is the head of the church. So that's a major division point there. So in addition to that, you're also going to see in Protestantism writ large is the idea of, write this phrase down, good Protestants read the Bible. Good Protestants read the Bible. And you can see how that, if you think about it, you can see how that is going to impact society writ large. I mean, beyond the church sort of thing. But we'll talk more about that with the English Reformation. But good Protestants read the Bible. You're going to do away with the idea of an intercessor. You're going to, because of Luther and his Reformation, you're going to do away with celibacy in the church in the sense that a priest needs to be celibate. Luther is eventually going to get married, and he has a bunch of kids with his wife Katie, his beloved Katie. And she was a former nun. And on and on. It's a quite extensive sort of thing. Also, the idea of what is the host? Is it the body of Christ, or is it a representation? That changes too. Your lack of sacraments, or at least especially as you get past Lutheranism, but you're going to take sacraments from all 7 down to about 2 in the Lutheran Church, and then other Protestants would reject it outright and just call it ordinances. And some of you are thinking, like, that's my church. So all these things have intellectual headwaters, and these are major, major differences between the Catholic Church and Protestantism writ large. But when you talk about Martin Luther, and if you knew about Martin Luther, your answer of who is he and what does he do, or where does it all come from, your answer probably was, well, Luther is going to be against indulgences and money. So over the years, I have been a little tricky with my students and essentially said to my students, you put maybe a true-false question or a trickily worded question on an exam saying, Luther's, the main impact, the most important impact of the Protestant Reformation was Luther's attack on indulgences. And that's simply not true. It's the inciting incident, but there's so much more, and it's so much more important than just money issues. But what are those indulgences? Around the year 1517, when Luther hangs 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg, there in Germany, Luther is going to be observant of some, frankly, tawdry and I would also say very crude electioneering and selling. Some of this stuff is just about as worse as the worst used car salesman you've ever seen trying to sell you a vehicle. The man's name is Johann or John Tetzel, Tetzel. John Tetzel was a Catholic priest, but he was really more of a salesman of indulgences. He's a salesman of pieces of paper. An indulgence is a dispensation by the Catholic Church that even has been used, I'm certain it's used to this day, but the last time I heard about it in popular media was around the year 2000 when John Paul II declared a Jubilee year in which by taking holy pilgrimages, say, to the Middle East or to Rome, would be a gain of indulgences. And in this case, what do indulgences do? It's then as now. Indulgence would basically grant a person a special dispensation to be released from purgatory faster. So that, and so we're clear about this, in the time of Luther, there were formulas to figure out roughly how long Daddy had in purgatory prior to moving on to heaven, to paradiso, to use Dante's phrase. And understand this, as I said previously to you, it was kind of understood in Catholic doctrine that being in purgatory while not being in hell was harder and more painful than anything that you'd experienced here in the flesh. So if you believe that, and you wanted to get dad or mom or some other, or yourself, out of purgatory faster, an indulgence was a thing to get a hold of, whether you did it for the best of reasons or for monetary reasons. Johann Tetzel, or John Tetzel, was a seller of indulgences. And you could get indulgences for traveling to Rome or to this or to that, or going to these more local relics, and they're all over the place in Germany. So Hitler. That's the first I've been reading about German history in the 1930s recently. But Martin Luther was well aware of all these different these relics and such that are out there, and a lot of the princes and municipalities will collect them to act as tourist attractions. I mean, there's a tawdry, money-grubbing aspect to it anyways, and it bothered Luther the older he got. But Tetzel, particularly, the way he went about selling those indulgences was basically as crude and as unseemly as it could be. And Luther had a temper, and he could get self-righteous with the best of them. And Luther basically had it, and he said, this isn't good. And what Tetzel would basically, he had a rhyme to it, and I've never taken the time to commit it to memory. But the rhyme basically went like this, is that as soon, and he was pitching this to people like an old patent medicine would in America in the 1920s would do. Basically, as soon as the coin clinks in the chest, the soul flies free to heaven. And again, it's got a rhyme to it, and it's lyrical, and I should probably commit it to memory, but I haven't. But the idea is as soon as you drop the money into the chest, and you sign the papers, and because the church is claimed to the keys to the kingdom through Peter and the Pope, therefore it's your daddy's soul's good. He's gone to heaven. And for a lot of people who were nervous about that sort of thing, and many would be to some degree or another, it was an attractive option. Get daddy. Do you care about your dad? Oh, I love daddy. Well, get him out sooner. You don't want him to hurt in purgatory any more than he has to. And so they did. The thing is that with a Tetzel sort, the Protestants would be saying, and some of you are thinking, oh my gosh, how horrible, great for Martin Luther for standing up and fighting against money grubbers in the church, the money changers, to use a biblical allusion. The fact is that it's also fair to remember too is that there's a whole lot of background stuff going in to this, one of which is the issue of offices, one of which is offices and one of which is architecture. One of the things you need to be aware of is that the church well before the Protestant Reformation would do in order to fund adventures and fund building projects and such like that. The fact of the matter is that they would also sell church offices, which you need to put in your notes is called simony. Selling of church offices is called simony. And so what would happen is the church would sell these offices, and they would sell, like the Archbishop of Dallas. The Bishop of Dallas could be sold. I'm not saying it has, but I'm just using it as an example. Famously, though, the Salzburg in Austria, which is like saying Salt City or Salt Town. Salzburg, Austria, which is home to white gold, which is salt. Salt is extraordinarily expensive and valuable in antiquity and in the medieval period or the Renaissance period compared to today where it's common. If you were the Archbishop of Salzburg, you were a wealthy man. Anyways, the Archbishop of multiple bishoprics or dioceses is a fellow named Albrecht of Mainz, and he's trying to raise money to pay back Pope Leo X. Make sure I say that. Yeah, Leo X for the purchase of more bishoprics. And there's a whole bunch of tawdry stuff in the background that I'm just going to have to skip over because of time constraints. But all that to say is that Tetzel, back to our salesman, is selling those indulgences to pay back the Pope, pay Albrecht of Maine, who had paid the Pope off. It's all everybody payola. The second thing is that all that money, or some of that money, is also being used to build, and this is where I always kind of leaven and try to tap the brakes for the Protestants for a second, is that some of that money, Albrecht of Maine's money, is going back to Rome to build some of the most beautiful pieces of architecture the world has ever seen in the form of St. Peter's Basilica, the Sistine Chapel, and so forth. Some of you have been to St. Peter's and the Sistine Chapel, and you know as well as I do that that's outstanding work. Some of the greatest examples of Renaissance architecture or artistry that you can have. And those guys who are really good, then as now, don't come cheap. And you have to pay for it. And so that's how they were paying for it. So on the one hand, the Protestants will be scandalized and will react very strongly, especially in England, against the idea of a church building and so forth. Keep in mind, we're going to talk about architecture in the form of how it takes in the United States and in the churches. But at the same time, too, some of the most beautiful pieces of architecture ever conceived of by the mind of man were done for churches or done for cathedrals, in this case, the seat of the Bishop of Rome in the history of man. So it's all out there. Luther is going to be kicked out of the church. He's excommunicated. He is going to avoid execution on several occasions. He is a prolific writer. The 95 Theses, which everyone knows about or should know about, is what sets the thing into motion. It's really called a debate in academic terms. Luther is going to have a flair for His speeches before the Diet of Worms, which is a town, is well known in Protestant circles. He writes quite a bit, and one of his most important pieces of work is called The Bondage of the Will in 1525. But anyways, Martin Luther, and I'm looking at my counter on my recordings, an hour and 4 minutes discussing a man who is extraordinarily important, but arguably in the history of the United States, far more individuals follow not after Luther, but they follow after a man who is a Frenchman, but spends most of his adult life not in France, but in exile in Geneva, Switzerland. And that man's name is John Calvin. We'll take up the story of Calvin and Calvinism in the next lecture.